Tonight, we're stepping back into the story of the man many consider the king of UFO whistleblowers, Bob Lazar. Most of you already know him as the quiet physicist who claimed he worked at a secret facility near Area 51, a place he called S4, studying technology that didn't come from Earth. But what most people don't know is what happened after he came forward. The interviews, the fame, and the controversy were only the beginning. When Lazar exposed what he said he saw, the fallout didn't just hit his reputation. It dismantled his education, his career, his clearance, his future, and even the lives of the friends who stood beside him. Tonight, we walk you through the part of the story almost nobody talks about. The consequences that followed him for decades, the investigations, the erasures, the raids, and the quiet pressure that never fully disappeared. Because telling the world about S4 didn't just make Bob Lazar famous, it made him a target. And by the end of this journey, you may find yourself asking one simple question. If Bob Lazar was lying, why did so many institutions work so hard to take him apart? Chapter 1. His life after exposing S4. When Bob Lazar sat down in front of a television camera in May of 1989, he was not prepared for how sharply his life would divide into before and after. At the time, he was not a public figure, not a man seeking fame, not someone with a platform or a following. He was simply a technician and experimenter living quietly in Nevada, someone who had already been struggling financially, someone who believed he had been pushed to a breaking point by the work he said he had seen inside the desert. In the interview with Las Vegas broadcaster George Knapp, he appeared under the name Dennis, his face hidden in shadow. He spoke softly. His descriptions were measured, almost reluctant. He explained that he had worked at a facility called S4, a location he said existed near Papoose Lake, just south of the long-rumored aerospace test site known as Area 51. He described 9 craft of unknown origin stored in hangars carved into a hillside. He described attempts to reverse engineer propulsion systems based on gravitational manipulation. And he described a fuel he called Element 115, an isotope that did not officially exist at the time. That broadcast was watched by tens of thousands of people in Nevada and quickly spread far beyond local news. What Lazar did not realize was that exposing S4, even cautiously and anonymously, would mark the final day of his ordinary life. From this point on, every institution that had ever touched his past, academic, scientific, governmental, or legal, would seem to shift in the same direction, away from him, away from anything that could confirm he had ever held the roles he described, and away from the version of his life he believed was real. The morning after the interview aired, the first signs of change appeared. As George Knapp would later recall, the phone lines at KLAS-TV began to light up. People asked questions about the facility, about the claim of government secrecy, about the strange details Lazar had revealed. The public wanted more. They wanted UFOs explained. They wanted to know why someone supposedly working in a classified research program had felt the need to speak out. But the institutions Lazar had named responded differently. The Department of Energy offered no comment. Nellis Air Force Base offered no comment. EG&G, the high-level government contractor he claimed conducted his hiring interviews at McCarran Airport, also offered no comment. Each response was concise and identical. No clarification. No denial that the facility existed. No attempt to question his story. Just a wall of silence. For Lazar, however, the silence was not the only reaction he noticed. In interviews he has given throughout the decades, Lazar has consistently stated that his life changed immediately after the broadcast. He claimed that his phone line began to behave strangely, clicking, interrupting, cutting off at odd moments. He claimed he noticed unfamiliar vehicles parking near his home or following him on drives. He said that the people who had known he was working at S4 fell quiet, and he claimed that he was completely cut off from all access to any government facility where he previously held clearance. These claims have not been confirmed in public records. No wiretap order or surveillance-related document has ever been released under FOIA that ties federal agencies to any of these events. But what is documented and undisputed is that the institutions he named refused to acknowledge anything about him, his past, or his alleged role. To understand the impact of this, it is useful to look at Lazar's life before that interview. This was a man who, despite financial struggles and inconsistent career paths, had once been photographed in a Los Alamos newspaper as a physicist at the Los Alamos Mason Physics Facility. This was a man who, according to friends, took advanced physics courses, built experimental devices in his home workshop, and gained a reputation in his community for his technical curiosity, famously building a jet-powered car that attracted local media attention years earlier. He was, by all accounts, someone who saw himself as a technician and an innovator. After the interview, however, his life begins to contract. Opportunities fall away. People distance themselves, and the institutions that should have contained some proof of his education or work history begin issuing denials that would soon define the rest of his public existence. But before those denials fully unfolded, before MIT said they had no record of him, before Caltech said the same, before Los Alamos publicly denied he had ever been on staff, there was this brief period right after the broadcast where Lazar's future could have gone in two very different directions. He may have expected the public reaction, the curiosity, the interviews, but he did not expect that his ability to work, to prove his background, or to re-enter scientific life would vanish almost immediately. In the days that followed, George Knapp pressed forward with more interviews. He questioned officials. He requested comment. He attempted to verify as much of Lazar's story as possible. The deeper he looked, the more contradictions arose, not only about what Lazar claimed, but about how agencies responded. Some refused to speak. Others denied knowledge of Lazar's involvement in any program. Still others simply kept silent, a silence that raised more questions than answers. For Lazar, the private consequences seemed even more difficult. He has repeatedly stated that after the interview, he felt unsafe. He felt that he had crossed a line that could not be undone. He felt that the government, his former employer as he described it, was unhappy that he had brought friends into the desert to watch the test flights, and that public exposure had been his only protection. Whether or not these details can ever be verified, they became part of the story that shaped his sense of what was happening around him. In later interviews, he described his decision to speak out as a form of insurance. He believed that if his story became public, nothing could happen to him quietly. If people knew his name, if people knew what he claimed he had seen, then there would be a record. The public would notice if he disappeared or met some unexplained fate. This fear, which he described calmly and without exaggeration, gives insight into the mindset he had at the time, isolated, uncertain, and feeling watched. From a viewer's perspective, this period, right after he appeared on television, is where the shape of his future becomes clear. Whether one believes his claims or sees them as fabrications, the effect on his life was the same. The institutions he expected to confirm his background did not. The career he believed he had built immediately became unstable, and the public image he formed in those first interviews would follow him for the next 3 decades. This chapter focuses on that initial fracture point because it sets the context for everything that follows. After this moment, Lazar's life no longer belonged to him in the way it once did. Whether silently or publicly, every institution connected to his history would soon begin distancing themselves from him. Government agencies would deny connections. Academic institutions would reject his claims. His reputation would soon be reshaped by legal issues, raids, and repeated public skepticism. But all of that begins here, in the days immediately after he spoke into a darkened camera describing a place called S4. Before the denials, before the criminal charges, before the raids, before the decades of controversy, before the scientific community dismissed him, before the UFO community turned him into an icon, before the word discredited appeared beside his name in article after article. This is where the break happened. This is where Bob Lazar's old life ended. And this is where the long, complicated destruction of his credibility, career, and identity began. Chapter 2. Emite denies him. When people look back at the Bob Lazar story, one of the clearest dividing lines between belief and skepticism rests on a single question. Did he attend the Massachusetts Institute of Technology? Lazar has repeatedly stated that he earned a master's degree in physics from MIT. He has spoken about classes he attended, instructors he worked under, and his time balancing academic work with his personal interest in high-energy propulsion experiments. In his telling, MIT was a central foundation of the career that eventually led him to the attention of government recruiters. But after Lazar came forward in 1989, MIT did something that would ripple through every part of his future. When asked whether Lazar had ever attended, they said something simple and absolute. There is no record of him. No transcripts, no enrollment history, no degree, no proof he ever stepped into an MIT classroom. This denial is where the first major break in his background becomes visible to the public. And it's a complicated chapter because it is made of 2 completely different sets of facts that exist side by side. What Lazar claims he lived, and what MIT's official position says today. To understand the situation clearly, it helps to go step by step, beginning with what Lazar has described regarding his education. According to Lazar, he completed a master's degree in physics at MIT in the early 1980s. He recalls attending courses in advanced physics and electronics. He has named specific professors who taught during that period, including instructors who were active in the physics department at that time, which aligns with publicly available historical faculty records. He has talked about the atmosphere on campus, the stress of his schedules, and his experiences balancing lab work with demanding theoretical coursework. He has said that while at MIT, he was not a standout academic, but was deeply interested in propulsion, particle physics, and the kind of research that would eventually align with programs at Los Alamos, and later, S4. In multiple interviews, he describes the MIT period as fast-paced, challenging, and filled with the kind of high-level scientific exposure that would make him an attractive candidate for classified projects. But when journalists and investigators looked for evidence that Lazar attended MIT, they found none. This part of the story is not ambiguous. MIT has no record of him, They do not have transcripts. They do not list him as a graduate. His name does not appear in public directories or archived graduation lists. There is no student ID number attached to him. Nothing in the official databases aligns with the academic history he describes. From MIT's perspective, it is simple. If his story were true, some documentation of it should remain. Universities keep extensive records, some of which go back decades. Transcripts are archived. Department rosters are stored. Physical paper files, common during the 1980s, are preserved. Degrees are confirmed. And even if a student changes their name or has missing paperwork in one system, there are usually secondary layers of records that fill in the gaps. Yet none of those layers contain him. This creates one of the biggest controversies of the Lazar story. Because if his education is missing, it becomes easier for critics to argue that nothing else he claims can be trusted. If the foundation of his scientific background isn't real, then perhaps the rest of his narrative isn't real either. For many skeptics, this is the most important part of the case. They believe that the MIT denial alone is enough to undermine everything Lazar has said about S4, gravity propulsion, and reverse-engineered craft. But the situation becomes more complex when you look at what else surrounds these missing records. One of the most important pieces of information comes from Lazar's own social circle during the 1980s. Several friends, including individuals who knew him before he appeared on television, have stated publicly that Lazar spoke often about taking classes at MIT. Some recalled him describing his coursework and commuting between academic obligations and employment. Others insist they saw him working on material that matched higher-level physics content. These statements do not confirm official enrollment, but they do create a conflicting picture compared to MIT's hard denial. There is also the frequently mentioned detail from investigative reporter George Knapp. While exploring Lazar's claims, Knapp contacted a dormitory extension at MIT using a phone number Lazar recalled from memory. According to Knapp, the number connected successfully to the correct dorm building, which he saw as surprising for someone who supposedly never lived or studied there. This detail doesn't prove enrollment, but it suggests Lazar had knowledge of the campus that would not normally be expected from someone with no affiliation. Another part of the story that complicates the academic question is Lazar's reputation for technical experimentation, long before 1989. In New Mexico and Nevada, he became known for building a jet-powered car, something that attracted local newspaper coverage years before his S4 claims. This level of ability does not require an MIT degree, but it does support the idea that Lazar had, at the very least, a deep interest in physics and engineering, whether formally trained or self-taught. Then there is Lazar's own explanation for why MIT has no record of him. Lazar has stated many times that after he joined the S4 program, his background files were taken over by the Department of Energy and the intelligence group handling his clearance. He claims that during the clearance process for S4, his academic, employment, and personal records were collected, reviewed, and possibly stored in classified archives. And he believes that after he went public, much of that information was removed or sealed to discredit him and to sever any official connection between him and the work he described. From his perspective, the missing records are not evidence he lied. They are evidence that the government responded aggressively to contain the leak. This explanation is not one that can be proven or disproven. There are no publicly released DOE documents confirming his clearance, his background checks, or the handling of his records. And no agency has ever acknowledged interfering with his academic history. But Lazar's claim does align with how clearance investigations work. It is true that top-level clearances involve deep background checks, including accessing academic, employment, and personal files. It is also true that classified personnel files are often unavailable to the public. And in rare cases, records can be sealed or moved. Whether that happened in Lazar's case is impossible to verify. Another important detail is the timeline. Public reporting shows that Lazar graduated from high school near the bottom of his class, not the kind of academic performance typically associated with acceptance into MIT. Critics point to this as solid evidence that his educational claims are fabricated. Supporters counter that unconventional academic paths are not unheard of, especially for students who later demonstrate strong technical ability. But the fact remains that nothing in his high school record suggests a traditional route into advanced science programs. Another factor worth considering is the role of Pierce Junior College in California, where Lazar is known to have attended classes during the period when he also claims to have been enrolled at MIT. Skeptics highlight this as a contradiction. Lazar has argued that he took certain courses concurrently or during transitional periods. Again, the details are debated and no definitive archival record resolves the conflict. All of this sets up a tension that defines much of the Lazar narrative. On paper, MIT has no record of him. In personal accounts, he appears to have knowledge of the campus and course material from that era. From the government's perspective, he was never there. From his perspective, everything he experienced was wiped out. In any normal case, an academic history is one of the simplest things to verify. If someone says they graduated from MIT, it takes only minutes to check. Universities do not lose records. They do not misplace degrees. They do not forget graduates. But the Lazar case is not normal. Once he spoke out in 1989, institutions that should have contained the pieces of his background responded with the same phrase over and over. We have no record of him. This chapter is important because it shows how quickly a person's past can become unstable. Whether the records were never there or were removed afterward, the effect on Lazar's life was identical. Without proof of his education, he could not enter academia. Without proof of his credentials, he could not join a research institution. Without confirmation of a degree, no aerospace company would consider him. This is where the dismantling of his credibility begins. A man with no educational records cannot defend himself against accusations of fabrication. A man who cannot prove where he studied cannot convince people he is who he says he is. And once the academic foundation is gone, everything built on top of it, employment, clearance, scientific work, becomes far easier to undermine. Whether one believes Lazar's explanation or MIT's official denial, one thing is clear. The missing academic records closed the door to every opportunity Lazar might have had after exposing S4. This was the first major structural collapse in his public identity, and it would set the tone for every chapter that followed. Chapter 3. Caltech erases his academic trail. If the MIT denial created the first major fracture in Bob Lazar's story, then Caltech's denial completed the break. Together, the two institutions formed a pair of pillars that should have held up the academic foundation of his life. When both pillars vanished, the entire structure became unstable, not just publicly, but in every direction his career might have gone. Lazar has always maintained that he earned 2 graduate degrees, one from MIT in physics and another from the California Institute of Technology in Electronic Technology. According to him, Caltech was where he deepened his understanding of electronics engineering, high-voltage systems, and the kind of technical frameworks that later became relevant when he said he was working on propulsion systems at S4. But much like MIT, when investigators contacted Caltech after Lazar came forward in 1989, the institution reported something absolute and unambiguous. There is no record of Bob Lazar ever attending Caltech. No transcripts, no application documents, no enrollment history, no thesis or research traces, no graduation record. This second denial added tremendous weight to the skepticism that grew around him. If one elite university has no record of a degree, it raises questions. If two do not, the effect becomes much more severe. And yet, just like the MIT chapter, the situation is more complicated than a single statement suggests. To understand why the Caltech denial matters so much to the broader story, it is necessary to look carefully at what both sides present as fact. Lazar's version of events is direct. He says that he attended Caltech after MIT, continuing graduate-level studies while balancing demanding employment schedules. He mentions commuting difficulties, time pressure, and the overlap of academic and technical work. He describes Caltech academically as smaller and more specialized than MIT, but equally intense. According to him, the work he completed there built on his earlier physics training and prepared him for high-level technical environments. But Caltech's official response is, like MIT's, absolute. They say they have no record of him. The registrar's office does not list him. His supposed degree does not exist in any graduation archive. There are no course registrations under his name, no student number, no instructor notes, and no paper trail of any kind. This contradiction is one of the clearest, simplest, and most persistent pieces of the Bob Lazar controversy. It sits at the center of every debate. Was Lazar a trained scientist recruited into a classified program, or was he a self-taught tinkerer who inflated his background? The truth is not easily resolved. There are several contextual elements that complicate the Caltech question, some that weaken Lazar's claims, and others that shift the story into more ambiguous territory. One important fact is that Lazar's known educational path prior to his claimed time at Caltech does not match the usual trajectory. Public records show that Lazar graduated from high school near the bottom of his class. This does not rule out future academic achievements, but it does suggest he did not follow a traditional route into elite research universities. Furthermore, records indicate that during the early 1980s, the same period he claims to have attended MIT and Caltech, Lazar was enrolled in courses at Pierce Junior College in California. This creates a timeline conflict that skeptics often cite as strong evidence that Lazar invented his academic history. It is unusual for someone to attend a junior college while simultaneously claiming to be completing graduate degrees at two prestigious institutions. But again, the picture is not that straightforward. Some individuals who knew Lazar during the 1980s have said he spoke about attending advanced classes and balancing heavy course loads. They recall him working on material that seemed well above the level of typical community college coursework. These accounts do not prove enrollment at Caltech, but they add weight to the idea that Lazar moved in technical circles and spent significant time studying on his own or in informal academic environments. Lazar also consistently mentions instructors from both MIT and Caltech, naming specific professors who were active in those departments during the correct years. These details match public faculty records. Skeptics argue that this information could be found through research, but Lazar provided some of these names before widespread online access made such searches effortless. There is also the question of why someone would need to fabricate two separate degrees if their intention was simply to create a facade of expertise. If Lazar had wanted to appear credible cheaply, he could have claimed a degree from one institution, not two. But his story has remained consistent for over 3 decades. He claims both, and he has never changed or softened the details. Another layer worth considering is the role of clearance investigations. Lazar has said repeatedly that during his hiring process for S4, government investigators pulled all of his personal, academic, and employment records. He believes these files, once removed from their original institutions, were never returned. In his view, this explains why both MIT and Caltech report no trace of him today. This possibility cannot be proven. There is no public documentation showing that the Department of Energy or an intelligence agency removed academic records. But it is true that individuals with high-level clearances often undergo deep background checks, and their files are handled differently from ordinary civilian documents. Whether that process includes the removal or sealing of academic history is not something publicly documented in Lazar's case, but he insists that this is what happened. It is also important to consider what Caltech's denial does not prove. It does not prove that Lazar lied. Universities do not explain why records are missing, only that they cannot be found. They do not comment on unusual circumstances or incomplete documentation. They do not provide speculation or context about how files could vanish. Their statement is narrow and procedural. If they cannot locate a record, they simply declare that they have no record of attendance. In Lazar's case, that simple statement carries extraordinary weight because it is paired with MIT's identical conclusion. 2 denials from 2 major institutions make it far more difficult for the public to believe Lazar's educational history. Yet for those who support him, this dual absence is exactly what they expect to see if Lazar's claims are real. In their view, erasing someone's academic past is one of the easiest ways to discredit them without direct confrontation. By removing the credentials that prove his background, agencies could undermine everything he said about S4 without ever needing to refute his story openly. It is an indirect but effective tactic. Eliminate the foundation, and everything above it collapses on its own. Whether this interpretation is accurate or not, it is what many in the UFO research community believe happened to Lazar after he went public. The real-world consequences of Caltech's denial were immediate and long-lasting. Without a degree on record, Lazar could no longer present himself as a graduate-level physicist or engineer. Even if he wished to return to academic work, he had no transcripts to support a new application. No institution could acknowledge him. His scientific credibility, at least in the traditional sense, was gone. This denial also made it easy for critics to dismiss his technical claims. When Lazar spoke about gravitational amplifiers, element 115, and extraterrestrial propulsion systems, detractors pointed not to the science, but to his missing degrees. In debates and articles, they simply said that someone without a verifiable graduate education could not possibly understand or work on the systems he described. This framing became one of the most powerful tools used against him. His lack of documentation slowly became evidence of dishonesty in the eyes of the scientific community, no matter how confidently he described his work or how consistently he repeated his story. The missing academic background overshadowed everything. But to understand the significance of the Caltech denial, it is important not to simplify the narrative. The denial does not resolve the truth. it only creates a discrepancy. At its core, this chapter is not about whether Lazar attended Caltech. It is about what happens when a man's academic history can no longer be proven, and how quickly that absence becomes a weapon against him. Caltech's denial closed another door that Lazar would never reopen. It became part of a pattern, institutions refusing to acknowledge his past, records missing where they should exist, and the steady erosion of his identity as a scientist. Whether these erasures reflect gaps in Lazar's story or responses to it depends entirely on interpretation. But the effect is the same. Without academic records, Lazar's credibility is permanently weakened in the public eye. And for a man who claimed to have worked on one of the most secretive scientific projects in American history, that loss was devastating. This chapter marks the second major structural collapse in Lazar's background. Combined with MIT's denial, Caltech's position ensured that Lazar could not re-enter the world of formal science. It guaranteed that skeptics would always have a simple angle of attack, and it helped shape the path of his life from that moment onward. A life defined not by the degrees he claimed to earn, but by the institutions that said they had never heard his name. Chapter 4, Los Alamos says he never worked there. When the academic denials from MIT and Caltech began spreading through the media after Bob Lazar appeared on television, those gaps created significant questions about his background. But the next denial he faced was not about school, where records can occasionally be lost or misfiled. It was about his employment at one of the most protective, heavily documented, and tightly controlled research centers in the United States, the Los Alamos National Laboratory. And unlike the academic situation, the Los Alamos chapter contains something that the MIT and Caltech chapters never did: physical, printed evidence from the early 1980s that directly contradicts what the institution later claimed. Lazar has always said that he worked at the Los Alamos Mason Physics Facility, known for its particle accelerators and high-energy research. In his telling, it was a world of heavy shielding, complex experiments, radiation safety procedures, and non-stop technical challenges. It was the kind of environment where people with unconventional skills sometimes found a place, even if their academic paths were not traditional. According to Lazar, this job was a major step in the chain of events that led to his eventual recruitment into the secretive S4 program. But when journalists reached out to Los Alamos after Lazar's 1989 interview, the official response was simple and direct. The laboratory stated that there was no record of Bob Lazar ever having worked there. Their human resources department did not list him. Their employment database did not contain his name. Their internal personnel system showed nothing to indicate he had ever been an employee, a scientist, or a technician. For many observers, this denial seemed decisive. If the lab had no trace of him, then perhaps the rest of his story was flawed. However, this is where the Los Alamos chapter diverges sharply from the academic ones. Because while MIT and Caltech said they had no record of Lazar and provided nothing that contradicted that position, Los Alamos left behind 3 separate pieces of early 1980s evidence showing that Lazar did, in fact, work at the Mason Physics Facility. And these documents existed long before he became publicly associated with UFOs or classified programs. The most compelling of these is the 1982 Los Alamos National Laboratory Phone Directory. This was a printed internal directory, produced for staff and contractors working at various facilities under the Los Alamos umbrella. Nestled inside that directory, organized alphabetically, is a listing for Lazar Robert, placed within the section that includes personnel working at the Mason Physics Facility. This directory has been scanned, examined, and referenced many times since the 1989 broadcast. It is not a rumor, not a copy created after the controversy, and not something that could have been inserted retroactively. It is a real directory, produced in an era where such records were physically printed and distributed. If Lazar had never worked at Los Alamos, his name would not have appeared there. The second piece of evidence comes from the Los Alamos Monitor, a local newspaper that covered events and people in the laboratory community. In 1982, the paper published a front-page article featuring Lazar standing next to his jet-powered Honda, a homemade engineering project that attracted local attention. In the article, Lazar is identified as a physicist working at the Los Alamos Mason Physics Facility. The photograph shows him smiling beside his vehicle, not as an outsider or visitor, but as someone familiar to the community. Local newspapers do not usually identify random individuals as employees of a national laboratory without verifying that information. The article's straightforward description of Lazar as a physicist suggests that, at least to the local community and newspaper staff, he was recognized as part of the scientific environment at the lab. The third piece of evidence is one of the most concrete: Lazar's W-2 tax form from Kirk-Mayer Inc., a major contractor that provided technical employees to the Los Alamos laboratory. This document shows that Lazar received income through Kirk-Mayer, confirming that he worked under one of the companies involved in staffing the laboratory. Many workers at Los Alamos are not directly employed by the lab, but by contractors who handle specialized technical roles. A W-2 form for Kirk-Mayer during the early 1980s fits perfectly with how contracted personnel gained access to the Mason Physics Facility. When all three pieces of evidence are placed together, a printed directory, a newspaper article, and a W-2 tax form, they form a picture that directly contradicts the laboratory's later denial. They suggest that Lazar was present at Los Alamos, that he was recognized inside the local community, and that he earned income as part of technical operations related to the lab. For supporters of Lazar's story, this contradiction is one of the strongest indications that something changed after he came forward on television. Critics have attempted to explain these inconsistencies in several ways. One argument is that Lazar may have been a technician rather than a physicist, and that the newspaper used the term physicist loosely. Another explanation is that contractor employees sometimes do not appear in the laboratory's direct employment records, which could possibly explain why human resources databases do not list him. Some skeptics say that the directory might have included contractor personnel who were working on site temporarily, and that this does not necessarily prove Lazar held a significant scientific role. These explanations do not fully resolve the contradiction, but they offer possible alternatives to the idea that the lab intentionally erased him. Yet they also raise an important question. If Lazar had such a minor or peripheral role, why would the laboratory deny any association at all, rather than simply clarifying the nature of his position? A limited role is still a role, and a contractor working on site is still an employee in the functional sense. The denial, in its absolute form, conflicts with the independent evidence. This situation becomes even more complex when viewed in conjunction with the timing of the denial. Los Alamos did not issue this statement in the early 1980s, when Lazar first arrived on site. They did not deny him in the years when he lived quietly and anonymously in Nevada. They only denied him after he appeared on television claiming involvement in highly classified propulsion projects related to extraterrestrial technology. The timing makes some observers believe the denial was an intentional effort to distance the laboratory from anything he might have seen or known. Lazar himself has always maintained that he worked at Los Alamos before joining S4, and that his performance there was part of the reason he was selected for the classified program. He describes the Meson Physics facility in detail in interviews, discussing equipment layouts, lab procedures, and aspects of the environment that match what other scientists have said about the facility during that era. He speaks about colleagues, daily procedures, and his own responsibilities in a way that suggests familiarity with the facility's workflow. For skeptics, the contradiction between Lazar's claims and the official denial is proof that he fabricated his background. They assert that without institutional confirmation, the newspaper article and directory listing do not necessarily prove scientific employment. They argue that Lazar may have exaggerated his role, using the proximity of contractor work to create the appearance of being a physicist. For believers, however, the contradiction is exactly what they expect from someone who broke secrecy. They see the evidence, the directory, the newspaper profile, the contractor W-2, as authentic indications of Lazar's presence. They view the denial as a typical response from a classified institution, attempting to sever ties with someone who leaked sensitive information. In their view, erasing his employment history is a predictable method of undermining his credibility. Regardless of interpretation, the consequences for Lazar were significant. Without Los Alamos acknowledging him, Lazar could not present himself as someone who had worked inside a high-level research environment. If the laboratory denied him, then the claim that he was later recruited into an even more secretive location, S4, appeared increasingly implausible to the public. This denial became a central talking point for skeptics, who frequently stated that someone with no verifiable research background could not have been selected for classified propulsion work. At the same time, the independent evidence supporting his presence at Los Alamos continued to circulate. It created a divide that still exists today, a split between the printed, physical evidence from the past and the institutional statements made years later. That divide continues to fuel debate about whether Lazar's story should be interpreted as fabrication, erasure, or something in between. What matters for Lazar's life story is the effect. When Los Alamos rejected him, publicly and without hesitation, it removed the last major piece of his professional identity. MIT and Caltech had erased his academic background. Los Alamos's denial erased his employment history. With this single statement, one of the nation's most important laboratories effectively invalidated the only credible foundation Lazar had for his claim of being recruited into classified research. This chapter shows how quickly a person's past can become unstable, especially when institutions begin to distance themselves. Once Los Alamos said Lazar was never there, it no longer mattered to many whether a directory from 1982 listed his name or a local newspaper had interviewed him. The official statement overshadowed the evidence. His credibility weakened further. His career became impossible to rebuild. And for the public, the question of his past became harder to answer with certainty. This denial, layered on top of the disappearances at MIT and Caltech, marked another step in the dismantling of Lazar's identity. It left him with no academic record, no laboratory record, and no institutional support to verify the experiences he said led to S4. Whether these erasures were the result of administrative errors, deliberate actions, or discrepancies in Lazar's own story, the outcome was the same: a once documented history became nearly impossible to prove, and that loss would shape the path of every chapter that followed. Chapter 5. His security clearance disappears. When Bob Lazar first spoke publicly about his alleged work at S4, one of the details he mentioned repeatedly was his security clearance. According to him, the position he held inside the facility required what is known as a Q-level clearance, a Department of Energy authorization that grants access to nuclear materials, restricted technologies, and certain classified programs involving exotic propulsion. This level of clearance is not typically held by technicians or support staff. It is issued to individuals who deal with sensitive information involving national security, advanced research, or nuclear operations. For Lazar, the clearance was not simply an administrative badge. It was the core of his identity inside the world he says he entered. After his 1989 interview, however, the Q clearance became another part of his life that seemed to vanish completely. In the same way that MIT, Caltech, and Los Alamos distanced themselves or denied any record of him, the Department of Energy and affiliated agencies eventually responded with statements that implied the same outcome. They had no record of his clearance, no documentation of his authorization, and no ties to any classified role he described. What should have been one of the most traceable aspects of his professional life, a government-issued clearance, had disappeared as thoroughly as his academic and employment history. To understand the significance of this, it helps to know what a Q clearance actually is. Unlike many forms of military clearance, a Q clearance belongs to the Department of Energy and is used for programs involving nuclear weapons, high-level technological research, and classified scientific operations. Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia, and other national laboratories routinely use Q clearances for personnel working on sensitive projects. The clearance process involves extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, financial reviews, personal interviews, and verification of education and employment history. It is one of the most rigorous vetting procedures available to civilians, and the documentation created during this process is extensive. Lazar has always been clear in his description of how he obtained his clearance. He says he was interviewed repeatedly, given polygraph tests, subjected to psychological profiling, and asked deeply personal questions about his family, finances, and personal life. He recalls being driven to various meetings by security personnel and going through multiple stages of approval before he was permitted to enter S4. He has described these procedures in detail for over 3 decades, never deviating from the language he used the first year he appeared on camera. But when journalists and researchers attempted to verify any part of this process through official channels, they ran into the same wall of silence that defined every institutional response to Lazar's story. The Department of Energy did not confirm any clearance. EG&G, the contractor Lazar said handled his hiring, declined to comment. Nellis Air Force Base, which manages parts of the Nevada test site, also declined to confirm anything. No agency acknowledged him, and none provided paperwork or internal references that could confirm a Q clearance in his name. For skeptics, this absence of confirmation became another powerful point of attack. If Lazar had truly undergone a clearance process, they argued, then some record of it should survive. Clearances are not awarded casually, nor are they processed without documentation. There are background forms, interview logs, security files, internal memos, and classification control numbers that track everything. These documents may be restricted, but their existence is not erased simply because a person leaves a program. Yet, interestingly, it is not unusual for clearance-related documents to be completely inaccessible to the public. Unlike academic transcripts or employment directories, clearance files are rarely disclosed or released, even decades later. Most of the forms used to process clearances are stored permanently inside secure government systems. In many cases, even confirming whether someone held a particular level of clearance is itself classified. The lack of confirmation from the Department of Energy does not necessarily mean no file existed. It only means the agency did not acknowledge it. And agencies declining to comment on matters involving classified programs is normal procedure. Silence does not prove absence. Lazar, however, took the disappearance of his clearance records as more than just a matter of restricted information. He believed they were removed. In numerous interviews, he has stated that after he went public, his personnel files, including his Q clearance, were pulled from the record. According to him, this was part of a broader effort to sever all traceable connections between him and the S4 program. He describes the process as systematic, removing evidence of both his academic path and his employment history, leaving him with nothing he could use to verify his past. This belief is consistent with how he experienced the events immediately following his televised interview. He has said that he was locked out of secure areas, denied future access, and treated as a security breach. He claimed that security personnel cut communication, restricted his movements, and made it clear that he was no longer part of any classified program. These experiences led him to conclude that, once he spoke publicly, he became a liability that needed to be erased from the official record. It is important to note that there are no FOIA-released documents confirming or denying the existence of Lazar's clearance. Unlike academic records or newspapers, clearance files cannot be accessed by reporters or researchers simply by request. This creates a situation where the truth of the matter cannot be independently verified. The absence of confirmation does not prove removal, but it does not debunk Lazar's story either. The clearance question remains suspended in uncertainty, supported only by Lazar's testimony and the circumstantial evidence around his employment at Los Alamos. Another layer that adds complexity to this chapter is the connection between Los Alamos, EG&G, and the Nevada test site. Lazar has said that EG&G conducted his hiring interviews at McCarran Airport and was responsible for transporting him to S4 using Janet flights, the unmarked aircraft that shuttle personnel to Area 51. While EG&G has never confirmed this, their involvement in classified transportation and security operations at the Nevada test site is well established. They have handled sensitive personnel transfers for decades. If Lazar's account is accurate, EG&G would have been the group most directly involved with his clearance and onboarding. Meanwhile, the DOE's refusal to comment is exactly what one would expect if someone disclosed restricted information. Agencies do not confirm clearances for individuals who go public about classified programs. They simply say nothing. Silence is part of protocol. The timing of the Q clearance disappearance aligns with the other erasures Lazar experienced. He spoke out in early 1989. Soon afterward, MIT had no record of him. Caltech had no record of him. Los Alamos said he had never worked there. And the DOE said nothing about any clearance he claimed to have held. For supporters, this pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. They believe Lazar's background was scrubbed deliberately to discredit him. For skeptics, the pattern reinforces the idea that his story was fabricated and that these denials are simply the institutions clarifying the truth. Both interpretations rely on the same evidence. They just frame it differently. What is indisputable is the impact of the vanished clearance. Without it, Lazar had no way to prove he ever worked inside a classified environment. He could not re-enter any restricted program. He could not apply for high-level scientific or engineering roles. He could not demonstrate the trustworthiness, reliability, or expertise expected of someone in advanced research fields. The loss of his clearance, official or unofficial, effectively barred him from ever working in sensitive science again. Lazar has said that after going public, he understood that his life in classified research was over. Whether the clearance was removed intentionally or simply left unacknowledged, it became another piece of his identity that no longer existed. He has described the feeling as watching parts of his life disappear behind doors he was suddenly no longer allowed to open. In many ways, the disappearance of the Q clearance is the chapter that ties together the entire unraveling of Lazar's professional identity. A clearance represents trust, responsibility, and access to advanced knowledge. Without it, every claim he makes about his time at S4 becomes harder to defend. It places all of his technical descriptions into a context where he must rely solely on his own testimony. And because the clearance cannot be verified, it allows skeptics to argue that nothing he says carries any weight. Yet at the same time, the failed attempt to disprove his Los Alamos employment, backed by physical evidence, makes the clearance question harder to dismiss. If the lab denied him, even though he was there, could other parts of his past also have been removed? This possibility keeps the debate surrounding his story alive even decades later. For Lazar, the loss of his clearance was not just bureaucratic. It was the end of his scientific future. It marked the point where he could no longer work in classified environments, no longer participate in cutting-edge research, and no longer access the world he says he once saw from the inside. It also marked the point where he became, in the eyes of institutions, someone they no longer recognized. This chapter stands as another part of how Lazar's life was dismantled after he spoke publicly. Whether one sees it as deliberate erasure, procedural silence, or the natural consequence of revealing secrets, the outcome was the same. Bob Lazar, once cleared for restricted work, became a man with no clearance, no institutional backing, and no way to prove his past. Chapter 6: Government Silence and Alleged Surveillance. In the days that followed Bob Lazar's 1989 television interview, the public waited for a response. The claims he made were not small. He had described a facility known as S4, allegedly located just south of Area 51. He described 9 flying craft stored inside hangars hidden in a mountainside. He spoke of gravity propulsion systems, Element 115, and technological capabilities far beyond normal aerospace development. These statements were bold enough that journalists, researchers, skeptics, and curious citizens immediately began contacting the agencies Lazar had mentioned. They wanted answers. They wanted confirmation or denial. What they received was something far more deliberate and far more controlled: silence. The Department of Energy declined to comment. Nellis Air Force Base declined to comment. EG&G, the contractor Lazar said conducted his hiring interviews, declined to comment. Los Alamos, when asked again, repeated its position that they had no record of him. Each refusal was short, procedural, identical in tone, and absolutely uninformative. There were no explanations, no clarifications, no attempts to contextualize Lazar's claims. Instead, these institutions created a wall where no one could move forward. To many observers, the silence itself became part of the story. It was not a denial. It was a refusal to engage at all. Silence from government agencies is not unusual when questions involve classified programs or restricted research. But in Lazar's case, the silence was paired with something else. Something that did not appear in official statements, but instead emerged from Lazar's personal experience. According to him, the period following his interview was filled with strange activity, subtle pressures, and signs that he was being watched by people he could not identify. In various interviews and recorded statements, Lazar has said that his phone began behaving strangely. He described clicks, line interruptions, and sudden cutouts that felt unnatural. He claimed that conversations sometimes terminated unexpectedly, or that background noise appeared at odd moments. In most circumstances, these would be small inconveniences, but for someone who had just revealed alleged classified information to the public, they took on a different meaning. Lazar also said that he noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his home. He claimed that vehicles appeared in his neighborhood that had never been there before, sometimes lingering for long periods without obvious purpose. He described cars with government contractor stickers or markings connected to Nevada test site workers. Whether these vehicles actually belonged to government personnel is not something that can be verified through public documentation. But Lazar consistently reported seeing them, and people close to him have said they noticed the same unusual patterns. Friends of Lazar, including individuals who were present for parts of his story, also said they were contacted or approached by people asking questions about him. They described men coming to their homes or workplaces, asking about Lazar's character, behavior, and personal life. According to Lazar, these interactions were not casual conversations. They were probing and direct, and they often gave the impression that the people asking the questions already knew the answers. None of these events can be proven through released government records. No surveillance logs, no official investigative notes, and no publicly disclosed documents verify that Lazar was under monitoring. Yet the claims form a consistent narrative in Lazar's retelling. He has said that these experiences were not dramatic or overt. There were no threats, no confrontations, no official warnings. Instead, the pressure was quiet, controlled, and persistent, a form of psychological weight that made him feel watched, even though no one explicitly acknowledged it. George Knapp, the investigative reporter who conducted the original KLAS interviews, has spoken about this period as well. Knapp has said that he also noticed unusual activity while covering Lazar's story. He described attempts to trace flight records, employment information, and facility access logs that suddenly became difficult to obtain. He stated publicly that Lazar's friends were interrogated by unknown parties and that the people who were questioned came away from the experience unsettled. Knapp has never claimed to have proof that government agencies surveilled Lazar, but he has made it clear that something unusual surrounded the situation. Adding to the atmosphere of suspicion was Lazar's account of his dismissal from S4. He has said that after the interview, he was immediately cut off from any future access to classified spaces. According to him, his badge privileges no longer worked, his transportation schedule was terminated, and all communication from his supervisors and security personnel ceased. This abrupt severing of ties reinforced his belief that he had crossed a line and that the government now saw him as a problem to be managed. The timing is significant. Lazar went public in 1989. The sudden changes in his life occurred almost immediately afterward. He described feeling as if an invisible switch had been flipped, one that removed him from every system he had once been a part of. This experience matches a pattern described by some former classified personnel. Once a worker violates secrecy agreements, agencies do not argue with them publicly. They simply close every door quietly and completely. Whether this is what happened to Lazar cannot be proven, but his description of the experience aligns with that process. It is also important to consider the broader context of the late 1980s. During that period, Area 51 was not publicly acknowledged by the U.S. government, even though it had been in operation for decades. Satellite images of the site were still classified. Flight restrictions in the region were extremely tight. Workers used unmarked aircraft to travel there. Secrecy was at its peak. If Lazar truly had leaked information about an internal facility like S4, it is reasonable to assume that the government would not respond openly. Silent management would be far more consistent with how such programs were historically handled. Lazar himself has said that the silence from official agencies was not surprising. He expected institutions to avoid acknowledging anything connected to classified work. What concerned him more was the quiet pressure he felt personally. He has claimed that he saw the same cars repeatedly. He said he received unusual phone calls. He described moments where he believed he was being followed. None of these experiences were extreme, but they were persistent enough that he felt his actions were being monitored. One of the most significant parts of this chapter involves Lazar's friends who accompanied him into the desert to watch test flights, a decision he has always said contributed to the government viewing him as a liability. Those friends later reported being confronted by security personnel who warned them not to return. According to Lazar, their names and license plate numbers were recorded. One friend said he was told directly, "You're in over your head." These incidents were never confirmed by official sources, but they were reported consistently by multiple individuals involved in the early stages of Lazar's story. It is difficult to parse the truth of these events from the outside. Surveillance claims, by nature, rarely come with paperwork. Agencies do not leave logs behind for the people they watch. And in the absence of documentation, the story becomes one built on testimony, perception, and interpretation. What is certain is that the reported silence from the government and the alleged surveillance created the sense that Lazar was experiencing something far more subtle than direct retaliation. It was a form of pressure that did not announce itself, but made its presence felt in small, persistent ways. For Lazar, this period marked the beginning of a long decline. He has said that the surveillance, whether real or perceived, made him withdraw from many aspects of his public life. He stopped discussing certain details. He avoided interviews for long stretches. He kept a lower profile. And he began to feel that his actions were constantly observed by people he could not identify. Some interpret these experiences as signs of psychological stress rather than actual surveillance. They argue that the pressure of public attention, combined with the controversy surrounding his story, could have heightened Lazar's sense of fear and suspicion. Others believe that the patterns he described are consistent with subtle counterintelligence monitoring, a method used to discourage further leaks without creating public records. Either interpretation leads to the same outcome. Lazar's life contracted into a smaller, more cautious version of itself. The combined effect of government silence and alleged surveillance was that he became isolated, both personally and professionally. Institutions refused to acknowledge him. Friends became wary of involvement. And Lazar himself began retreating from many aspects of his former life. This chapter reveals something essential about what happened to him after 1989. Whether the surveillance was real or imagined, whether the silence was procedural or deliberate, Lazar felt the full weight of it. The institutions he believed once supported him now acted as if he had never existed. The people he trusted described men asking about him, and he found himself living in a version of reality where every unanswered phone click and every unfamiliar car felt like a reminder that his decision to speak publicly carried consequences. This is the part of Lazar's story where the dismantling of his life shifted from institutional reaction to personal impact. He was no longer simply someone with erased records or disputed credentials. He was someone who felt watched, pressured, and silenced in ways that left lasting changes on his behavior. Whether those pressures were intentional or circumstantial, they shaped the next stages of his life and deepened the sense that the world he had entered, intentionally or not, was one that did not allow people to leave without a cost. Chapter 7. The 1990 Brothel case used to discredit him. By the beginning of 1990, less than a year after Bob Lazar publicly revealed the existence of S4, the momentum of his life had already shifted dramatically. His academic records were denied. His employment at Los Alamos had been erased by official channels. His security clearance was gone. His friends had been questioned. His phone behaved strangely, and he had begun withdrawing from the public world. But the most damaging event, the one that would permanently mark his reputation and follow him for decades, appeared in March of that year, quietly at first, then loudly, as newspapers and television reports began circulating the arrest of Robert Lazar of Las Vegas on charges related to a prostitution ring. To understand the effect of this case, it is important to see what is documented, what Lazar states, and how the system responded in a way that magnified the damage far beyond the underlying incident. According to official police records, Lazar was charged with pandering, a crime in Nevada that generally refers to assisting, organizing, or facilitating prostitution. But the investigation files show a slightly more complex reality. Lazar did not own or operate the brothel. He was not the manager. He was not involved in recruitment, finances, or daily operations. According to both Lazar and the detectives involved, he came into the picture because a friend or acquaintance asked him for help installing a security system in the building. Law enforcement later discovered his involvement through his own cooperation and through equipment records that connected him to the premises. Lazar has always maintained that he did not knowingly participate in the criminal operation beyond assisting with technical installation work. He said he helped set up cameras and recording devices, and that when police later came to question him, he answered their questions honestly and transparently. Multiple public statements from investigators during that period confirm that Lazar was cooperative and provided information willingly. Detectives involved in the case stated that Lazar told them everything he knew about the brothel's activity, employees, and logistics. But despite his cooperation, prosecutors chose to move forward aggressively with the charges, and the way the case unfolded created the precise kind of public spectacle that would damage Lazar's image at the exact moment he was becoming the most controversial UFO whistleblower in the country. The case became public unusually quickly. Local newspapers reported the arrest with Lazar's full name, listing his address, occupation, and background. Television stations followed the story. Reporters connected Lazar to UFO claims, describing him as the same man who had spoken about Area 51 months earlier. Headlines linked the two narratives together, even though the charges had nothing to do with his statements about S4. This immediate, widespread publicity was not typical for a small-scale pandering case. In Nevada, cases involving brothels or prostitution often stayed relatively low profile unless they were part of a high-level trafficking investigation or involved well-known individuals. But in Lazar's situation, coverage spread rapidly, and the media narrative was steered toward the idea that the Area 51 whistleblower had now been arrested for involvement with a prostitution operation. Even though he cooperated, even though his role was minor, and even though he was not accused of violence, coercion, or exploitation, the label was enough to damage him permanently. George Knapp, who had been investigating Lazar's claims since 1989, later stated publicly that people inside law enforcement expressed discomfort about how the case was handled. According to Knapp, at least one investigator commented that the situation looked like someone wanted him discredited. Knapp has repeated this sentiment in interviews across multiple decades, emphasizing that the punishment and media attention seemed disproportionately severe compared to the underlying facts. The case moved through the court system quickly. Lazar eventually entered a guilty plea, something he has said he did to end the process as swiftly as possible, believing that prolonging it would only bring more attention and strain. The plea resulted in probation and community service, not jail time. From a legal perspective, the punishment was relatively mild, but from a reputational perspective, the damage was profound and permanent. For skeptics of Lazar's story, the brothel case became solid proof that he was untrustworthy. Articles discussing his S4 claims routinely referenced the arrest as evidence that he was a criminal, a liar, or someone operating on the fringes of legality. Debunking groups used the case to paint Lazar as someone with a history of deception. Skeptics argued that if he could be involved in a brothel, then he could easily lie about academic degrees or employment history. The nuance of the case, that he installed a security system, was rarely mentioned in these discussions. Supporters of Lazar, however, saw the timing and the publicity as suspicious. They pointed out that the arrest came in the exact window when Lazar's claims were receiving national attention. They noted that the case was pushed into the media with unusual force, and they emphasized that even the detectives acknowledged Lazar had cooperated rather than obstructed. For them, the brothel case seemed like a tool, a way to introduce a criminal record that would weaken Lazar's credibility without directly confronting his claims about classified technology. The effect on Lazar's life was more severe than the legal consequences suggested. With a criminal conviction, even for a relatively minor offense, Lazar found that many doors in the scientific and technical world were now closed to him. Federal contractors do not hire individuals with criminal records for sensitive work. Laboratories conducting nuclear or aerospace research require background checks that immediately disqualify anyone with a pandering conviction. Even private sector companies in technical fields often view criminal records, especially those involving moral or ethical violations, as barriers to employment. For Lazar, who was already facing institutional denials of his academic and employment background, the brothel case became the final obstacle preventing him from ever re-entering any kind of formal scientific environment. Without degrees, without Los Alamos acknowledgement, without a clearance, and now with a criminal record, he had no path to return to the world he once inhabited. Whether those erasures were the result of deliberate action or simply the consequences of his own choices, the combination left him unable to rebuild his career. The public perception of Lazar also shifted dramatically after the arrest. Media outlets that had once covered his claims with curiosity began framing him as unreliable. Commentators referred to him as disgraced. Debunkers cited the case in articles, presentations, and radio appearances for decades afterward. Even today, many skeptics still point to the brothel conviction as their primary reason for dismissing his entire story. The contrast between the severity of the public reaction and the actual details of the case is striking. Lazar did not manage the brothel. He was not accused of coercion or trafficking. He did not profit from the operation. His involvement, as stated in law enforcement records, was limited to helping install equipment. But in the world of public perception, nuance rarely survives. The headline alone, Area 51 whistleblower arrested in prostitution case, was enough to ensure that Lazar's credibility would be permanently compromised. For Lazar personally, the brothel case also marked a moment of emotional collapse. He has said that during this period, he realized that regardless of the truth behind his claims about S4, no one would ever take him seriously again. The institutions he once believed in had rejected him. The media was turning against him, and the legal system had branded him with a conviction that would follow him for the rest of his life. In many interviews, he describes the experience calmly, but with a quiet sense of resignation. He does not defend himself by attacking the system or claiming victimhood. He simply states the facts and acknowledges that the damage cannot be undone. This chapter represents a turning point in the dismantling of Lazar's public identity. The academic denials undermined his qualifications. The Los Alamos denial weakened his professional foundation. The disappearance of his clearance cut off his future in classified research. But the brothel case struck at his character and integrity. It offered skeptics a simple, memorable way to dismiss him. It provided the public with a scandal that overshadowed the complexities of his story, and it ensured that every discussion of Lazar's credibility from that point onward would be divided by this single incident. Whether one interprets the brothel case as a genuine legal issue, an unfortunate coincidence, or a targeted smear, its impact on Lazar's life was unmistakable. It became the most effective tool for discrediting him in the public eye, and it remains one of the reasons why his claims, no matter how detailed or consistent, continue to be viewed with skepticism. In the larger story of how Lazar's life was dismantled after speaking out, this chapter is one of the clearest examples of how quickly a man can lose control of his narrative once the legal system becomes involved. Chapter 8. He can no longer work in science. By the time the dust had settled in 1990, Bob Lazar's life had already been reshaped by a series of blows that no scientist or technician could hope to recover from. His academic history was denied by 2 major universities. His employment at Los Alamos was erased by official statements, despite printed evidence to the contrary. His clearance no longer existed in government systems accessible to the public. And the brothel case, widely publicized and frequently exaggerated, had added a criminal conviction to his name. For many who watched the story unfold, this was the moment where Lazar stopped being a figure connected to advanced research and became, instead, someone who was publicly and permanently removed from scientific life. To understand how total that removal was, it is necessary to consider what makes scientific careers possible in the first place. Most high-level scientific or technical roles, whether in academia, national laboratories, or aerospace industries, rely heavily on 3 pillars: provable education, verifiable employment history, and some measure of background clearance or trustworthiness. Lazar had lost all 3. Whether these losses occurred naturally through institutional distancing or through deliberate action is something that remains debated, but the consequences were indisputable. Every path he once could have taken in science narrowed until none were left. After the Brothel case, Lazar found himself in a position where he could no longer present a credible resume in any traditional sense. Without academic transcripts, he had no way to demonstrate that he held graduate degrees. Without confirmation from Los Alamos, he had no evidence of real-world laboratory experience. Without a recognized clearance, he had no way to prove he had ever worked inside secure or classified environments. And with a criminal conviction, he had a mark on his record that would automatically disqualify him from certain government and corporate positions, even if the other gaps had never existed. This combination meant that, from the perspective of scientific institutions, Lazar was effectively invisible. Universities could not verify him. Laboratories could not hire him. Aerospace companies could not trust him. Even private research environments, which sometimes operate with more flexibility, would have found it nearly impossible to integrate someone whose background could not be confirmed and whose legal history introduced risk. Whether one believes Lazar's story or not, this aspect of his life is a factual reality. In the world of science and engineering, a missing academic record, a denied employment history, and a criminal conviction together form a barrier that almost no one can overcome. During the early 1990s, Lazar did not immediately disappear from public attention, but he withdrew substantially from scientific spaces. His interviews during that period reflect a tone of resignation. He appeared less interested in convincing others of his story and more focused on accepting the consequences of having told it. At multiple points, he expressed regret that his life had changed so dramatically. He said he no longer had access to the tools, environments, or collaborative opportunities he once enjoyed, and he acknowledged, calmly and often without emotion, that he would never again work in the field of advanced research. Some people have argued that Lazar could have rebuilt his academic history by returning to school. But this argument overlooks several barriers. A criminal conviction, especially one involving moral charges like pandering, would complicate admissions to institutions involved in sensitive research. More importantly, without any records showing previous coursework or degrees, Lazar would have had to begin again from the undergraduate level. That path might have been possible, but it would not have restored his original trajectory. Even if he earned new degrees, no classified facility would issue a clearance to someone whose personal background contained both major inconsistencies and a criminal record. From the perspective of national security protocols, Lazar was no longer trustworthy. The question of trust is at the core of why Lazar could never return to science. Scientific institutions, particularly those connected to government research, require stability, reliability, and predictability in personnel. Lazar, after publicly accusing the U.S. government of hiding extraterrestrial technology, was by definition unpredictable. Whether he was telling the truth or inventing a story, he had shown a willingness to speak publicly about sensitive topics. No facility would risk placing someone like that, someone whose motives could be interpreted as dangerous or unstable, anywhere near classified research again. Even outside the classified world, the combination of missing credentials and an infamous public profile made him unemployable. Scientific work often depends on collaboration, peer review, and institutional credibility. A researcher who cannot prove where they studied or where they worked cannot secure grants, publish papers, or join research groups. Lazar's inability to document his background ensured that he would remain isolated, unable to participate in the scientific networks that shape careers. It is also worth noting that Lazar's technical interests were always oriented toward fields that required strict security measures. Particle physics, propulsion research, and nuclear-related experiments all fall under categories of work where verification and clearance are non-negotiable. If Lazar had pursued chemistry, electronics repair, or independent engineering, the loss of credentials might not have been catastrophic. But the areas he cared about most were the ones that demanded the highest levels of accountability. In those domains, even small inconsistencies in a resume would destroy a person's chances. In Lazar's case, the inconsistencies were enormous, and they were publicly amplified. The Brothel case added an additional layer of difficulty. Scientists, engineers, and researchers often undergo annual background checks. Convictions involving moral issues, even relatively small ones, raise concerns about judgment, decision-making, and vulnerability to coercion. In classified environments, someone with even a moderate legal or financial issue can be seen as a potential risk. For Lazar, the conviction made it impossible to be viewed as a secure or reliable candidate for any sensitive position. In many ways, this conviction locked the door on his scientific future more firmly than even the academic or employment erasures. Lazar himself seems to have understood this quickly. In the years following the case, he stopped pursuing scientific employment entirely. He did not attempt to re-enter Los Alamos. He did not apply to other laboratories. He did not pursue aerospace companies or research institutions. Instead, he began redirecting his energy into smaller, more independent ventures. Work that did not require credentials, degrees, or clearances. These ventures eventually led to the founding of United Nuclear Scientific, a company focused on chemicals, rare materials, lasers, magnets, radiation sources, and other scientific supplies. This shift marked the start of a new chapter in his life, one where he built a technical career around products rather than institutions, around curiosity rather than credentials. Supporters of Lazar often argue that the combination of institutional silence and legal pressure appears deliberate. They note that the very systems Lazar once claimed to work within, academic, research, technical, and classified, all seemed to reject him in the same narrow window after he spoke publicly. They point out that the Brothel case, despite its relative smallness, was amplified heavily in the media during the height of the Area 51 controversy. They emphasize that the institutions involved released statements only after the television interview, not before. In their interpretation, this pattern looks like a coordinated effort to separate Lazar from his past and prevent him from retaining any scientific legitimacy. Skeptics argue the opposite. They believe Lazar fabricated his background and that the denials from institutions are simply expressions of the truth. They contend that the Brothel case was unrelated to any secret pressure and that Lazar's inability to return to science reflects the natural consequences of dishonesty. They also point out that even if Lazar had been a contractor at Los Alamos, contractor roles do not necessarily grant scientific authority. In their view, the collapse of Lazar's scientific future was an inevitable outcome of his reputation collapsing under scrutiny. Neither interpretation can be proven with absolute certainty. What can be stated with certainty is the factual outcome. After 1990, Lazar never again worked in any environment connected to mainstream scientific institutions. He never regained a clearance. He never restored his academic records. He never returned to a laboratory similar to Los Alamos. and he never held any position in government research, aerospace development, or advanced propulsion work. His scientific life ended early, abruptly, and permanently. This chapter is essential because it marks the point where Lazar's personal and professional worlds fully diverged. Before 1989, he lived in a space where scientific ambition and opportunity were still possible. After the denials, after the surveillance, and especially after the Brothel case, he no longer belonged to that world. The loss of his scientific future was not merely a consequence of one event, but the combined force of multiple erasures, each one making the next more devastating. For Lazar, this loss shaped everything that came after. It influenced the business he later built. It influenced his desire to stay out of public attention. It influenced the way he spoke in interviews, often with a quiet tone that conveyed resignation rather than urgency. And it influenced the way the world saw him, not as a scientist, not as an engineer, not as a researcher, but as someone disconnected from every institution that once defined him. Whether one believes his story or not, the fact remains the same. Bob Lazar's scientific career ended not because of a lack of interest or ability, but because the institutions that defined scientific legitimacy closed their doors to him, one after another, until there were no doors left. Chapter 9. United Nuclear, his only remaining career path. By the early 1990s, the world Bob Lazar once imagined for himself, a world of laboratories, research teams, classified engineering projects, and scientific advancement, had moved beyond his reach. Whether this happened because of institutional retaliation, natural consequences, or a mixture of both, the result was the same. Lazar was a man with scientific skill and curiosity, but with no academic records, no government clearance, and a public reputation marked by controversy. In that environment, no laboratory, corporation, or research institution would hire him. For a person whose life revolved around experimentation, technical engineering, and problem solving, this left him with only one realistic path forward. If no institution would allow him into their world, he would create one of his own. This is the setting in which United Nuclear Scientific began to take shape, not as a corporate empire or a major research company, but as a survival strategy for a man who had been ejected from every formal scientific space. In interviews over the years, Lazar described himself not as someone searching for legitimacy, but as someone searching for work that allowed him to stay connected to scientific tools, materials, and ideas. United Nuclear, in his mind, was less a business and more an engineering environment he could build from scratch, free from institutional gatekeeping. United Nuclear began modestly. Lazar initially started selling scientific supplies from a small building, focusing on items difficult for the average person to obtain: rare earth magnets, elements and chemicals used in experiments, laser components, vacuum tubes, radioactive minerals, laboratory glassware, high-voltage parts, and other equipment that hobbyists, teachers, or amateur experimenters might need. In its early days, the company was primarily online, long before e-commerce became a mainstream part of everyday life. Lazar's approach emphasized accessibility, providing sophisticated or unusual materials to people who would normally have no access to them due to cost or regulation. From publicly available records, several aspects of United Nuclear's growth can be pieced together. The business gradually expanded into a combination of online sales, warehouse operations, and a physical supply shop. It offered not just basic equipment, but items with more complex applications. NASA-grade aerogel, meteorite samples, cryogenic materials, radioactive check sources, and various high-voltage devices. These offerings placed United Nuclear into a niche market of amateur scientists, university physics instructors, and independent researchers. For Lazar, this environment was ideal. He has always been a hands-on experimenter, and the business gave him the freedom to continue building, testing, and manipulating materials without needing access to a laboratory. Customers who interacted with him often described him as friendly but quiet, deeply technical, and uninterested in discussing UFOs or conspiracies. Instead, he focused on chemistry, safety protocols, experimental equipment, and the kind of detailed technical work he could no longer do in any formal institutional setting. The survival of United Nuclear also relied on Lazar's reputation among hobbyists. The controversial nature of his past attracted people who were curious about his knowledge, but at the same time, it alienated mainstream institutions. For some customers, United Nuclear was simply a unique supplier. For others, it was a way to support someone they believed had been unfairly targeted. And for skeptics, the business became a reminder that Lazar's scientific curiosity had not evaporated despite his damaged credibility. But operating a business that sold chemicals, radioactive materials, and high-voltage components meant dealing with regulatory environments that were strict and heavily monitored. This reality would soon bring government authorities into Lazar's life again, this time not because of UFOs, but because of the nature of the products he sold. United Nuclear was never a conventional business, and the deeper its inventory expanded into controlled materials, the more attention it attracted from federal agencies. One of the earliest documented conflicts with authorities came in the early to mid-2000s, when United Nuclear became the subject of an investigation involving the sale and shipment of components that could be used to create illegal fireworks or explosive mixtures. According to federal court records, United Nuclear had sold chemicals that, when combined, were regulated under the Federal Hazardous Substances Act. The government argued that the business had shipped certain materials without proper compliance procedures, particularly to customers in states with strict regulations. Lazar consistently argued that he believed the sales were legal, but after a lengthy investigation, he ultimately entered a guilty plea in 2006. He was fined and placed under supervision as part of the settlement. This event, while relatively minor in the broader scope of legal history, reinforced a pattern that had begun years earlier. When Lazar's life intersected with government systems, the consequences were often outsized. To understand why this legal issue mattered to Lazar's life trajectory, one must consider that by this time, he already carried the weight of his earlier erasures. No academic records, no employment verification, and a criminal conviction from the 1990 case. The additional legal trouble associated with United Nuclear further solidified his exclusion from scientific institutions. Even if he had attempted to re-enter research or secure a technical role, the new conviction would have compounded the existing barriers. As a result, United Nuclear was no longer just a side business or an alternative. It became, by necessity, the center of Lazar's professional identity. The most dramatic moment in United Nuclear's history came in 2016 and 2017, when FBI and EPA agents executed a raid on the business. Officially, the raid was linked to a criminal investigation involving thallium, a highly toxic element used in a real, documented homicide. The victim, a woman who died in Michigan, had been poisoned with thallium, and authorities were tracking the distribution channels of chemicals, that could be used in the case. Public records confirm that this homicide investigation was legitimate and that federal agencies had a legal basis for tracking the movement of restricted chemicals. United Nuclear did sell thallium in small quantities, and thus the company fell within the scope of the investigation. What complicates the story is how the raid unfolded and how Lazar and his employees interpreted the event. Employees who were present stated publicly that the agents seemed less concerned with chemical shipment logs and more interested in Lazar himself. They said the agents asked about military materials and repeatedly mentioned Lazar's background. According to these accounts, the agents showed a notable interest in whether Lazar had ever possessed or still possessed anything related to the technologies he claimed to have seen at S4. Lazar also said the raid occurred the day after filmmaker Jeremy Corbell conducted an on-camera interview with him about element 115, the exotic, allegedly stable isotope he had described since 1989 as the propulsion fuel at S4. In interviews following the raid, Corbell stated that this timing was too coincidental to ignore. He said that the raid felt connected to Lazar's S4 story and claimed that agents had asked questions unrelated to the homicide investigation. The FBI did not confirm this, and no government agency released documents supporting the idea that Lazar's past played a role. But the perceptions of those present and the timing relative to the element 115 interview created a sense that the raid was not merely procedural. For Lazar, the raid was another reminder that his life could never truly return to normal. Whether the agent's interest was exaggerated, misinterpreted, or entirely accurate, the result was the same. United Nuclear had drawn scrutiny from federal agencies again, and Lazar found himself facing questions that connected his current business back to his past claims. After the investigation concluded, United Nuclear resumed operations, but the event added another layer to Lazar's reputation, one that mixed the practical realities of chemical regulation with the long-standing mystery surrounding his background. Throughout all these events, United Nuclear remained Lazar's only stable environment. In interviews, he rarely dramatized his situation. He described the business as a place where he could continue exploring scientific ideas on his own terms. He preferred experimentation over debate, technical work over public attention. He has often said that he would rather work with materials and equipment than argue with skeptics or speculate about government motives. United Nuclear allowed him that escape. It provided a controlled world where he could focus on experiments, build devices, and stay close to the scientific curiosity that shaped his early life. At the same time, the existence of United Nuclear is a testament to how drastically Lazar's life changed after 1989. Instead of working in national laboratories, he sold rare earth magnets to schoolteachers. Instead of experimenting with particle physics under supervision, he designed high-voltage kits for hobbyists. Instead of studying advanced propulsion within classified hangars, he calibrated Geiger counters for customers online. This shift was not a gradual evolution, but a forced redirection imposed by the collapse of every path that once lay before him. United Nuclear stands today as a symbol of both Lazar's resilience and his isolation. It shows that he continued to pursue science despite the loss of institutional support. It also shows that he never returned to the world he once claimed to inhabit. Whether one sees United Nuclear as a refuge, a downgrade, a reinvention, or a survival mechanism, it marks the point in Lazar's life where his identity as a scientist became entirely self-directed. In the larger narrative of how Lazar's life was dismantled, This chapter illustrates the consequences of losing an entire professional foundation. A man who once worked with particle accelerators now sold supplies to amateur experimenters. A man who once claimed to handle extraterrestrial propulsion now handled customer service emails about laboratory glassware. His career did not end. It transformed into something fundamentally different, shaped entirely by the doors that had closed. For Lazar, United Nuclear was the only path left. And whether by circumstance or design, it became the world he would live in for the rest of his life. Chapter 10: The 2003-2007 Federal Case and Its Impact. By the early 2000s, Bob Lazar had been living outside the scientific establishment for more than a decade. United Nuclear Scientific, the business he founded out of necessity, had become his new professional identity. The company allowed him to spend his days working with chemicals, magnets, meters, radiation samples, high-voltage equipment, and unusual scientific materials. He no longer had the clearance or institutional backing required to work in particle physics or advanced engineering, but in his workshop, surrounded by the buzzing of transformers and the sharp scent of solvents, he could at least continue doing what he loved, experimenting. But the kind of materials United Nuclear handled, chemical compounds, oxidizers, high-energy mixtures, radioactive sources, and rare elements, put Lazar within a regulatory environment filled with federal oversight. For most businesses, these regulations are simply technical hurdles. For Lazar, whose name already attracted scrutiny from various corners of the government, these regulations became another doorway through which official pressure could enter his life. The trouble began around 2003, at a time when United Nuclear had become increasingly popular among amateur scientists, educators, and hobbyists. Customers sought out the company specifically because it sold materials that were difficult to obtain elsewhere. Some were entirely harmless in the right context. Others, like oxidizers and reactive powders, required caution. Among these products were chemicals that could be used to make high-power fireworks, a fact that by itself did not automatically imply wrongdoing. Many small scientific suppliers sold similar chemicals, and many hobbyists used them legally for pyrotechnic displays or experimental purposes. The problem arose when the Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, working with federal agents, began monitoring the movement of particular chemicals used for creating flash powder, an energetic compound used in large-scale fireworks. Federal law requires specific limitations on how these chemicals can be sold and shipped. During an investigation, CPSC agents traced certain regulated components back to United Nuclear. According to court records later made public, United Nuclear had sold substances such as potassium perchlorate and other oxidizers to customers in states where those chemicals were restricted or required special licensing. Lazar and his staff argued that they believed the sales were legal. They claimed they provided materials only in small quantities and believed customers were using them responsibly. But to regulators, the issue was not about intention. It was about compliance. Once the shipments were traced, United Nuclear became the target of a federal investigation. Authorities executed search warrants, seized computers, reviewed transaction records, and conducted interviews with employees. From the outside, the investigation may have looked like a footnote, just another enforcement action by the CPSC. But for Lazar, it showed that government agencies were again stepping into his life, this time through the narrowest possible channel, the sale of chemicals. The case progressed slowly. Investigations that involve chemical regulations often require detailed examination of records, shipping logs, emails, and customer histories. Lazar cooperated with authorities, and according to statements he later made, he believed he had nothing to hide. But the investigation found that United Nuclear had indeed shipped regulated chemicals across state lines without completing the necessary compliance steps or verifying the legal status of the purchases. In 2006, after 3 years of legal pressure, federal prosecutors filed charges under the Federal Hazardous Substances Act. The charges did not suggest violence, trafficking, or malicious intent. Instead, they focused narrowly on regulatory violations. The government claimed United Nuclear sold fuels and oxidizers that could be used for explosive mixtures, and that these products were distributed without proper oversight or adherence to shipping rules. Lazar and his company were ultimately charged with introducing banned hazardous materials into interstate commerce. While the case did not accuse him of creating explosives or promoting illegal activity, the legal consequences were serious. After lengthy negotiations, Lazar entered a guilty plea. The decision was less about conceding wrongdoing and more about ending a prolonged legal process that had drained resources and created uncertainty about his business's future. The court ordered Lazar and United Nuclear to pay fines, and the company was required to change how it handled and distributed certain chemicals. United Nuclear was restricted from selling regulated oxidizers without strict compliance procedures, and Lazar's business practices now fell under closer scrutiny from federal agencies. Though he avoided jail time, the conviction added yet another mark to his personal and professional record. For most scientists, a single regulatory violation might be seen as a minor administrative failure, especially if the issue involved unclear rules or unintentional sales. But for Lazar, the consequences were amplified by his already precarious history. He now had 2 criminal convictions attached to his name: the 1990 pandering case and the 2006 hazardous materials case. Together, they made it virtually impossible for any laboratory, institution, or aerospace company to consider him for any role involving trust, clearance, or scientific responsibility. Even if someone wished to hire him purely for technical expertise, the legal record would prevent it. Companies conducting sensitive research cannot employ individuals with convictions related to controlled materials. National laboratories cannot issue badges to someone whose background contains security-related or chemical-related offenses. Aerospace contractors cannot justify taking on someone who has been at the center of legal issues linking him to both classified claims and restricted substances. By the end of the case, Lazar's path back into scientific research was not merely unlikely, it was legally closed. The broader significance of the 2003-2007 case goes beyond the charges themselves. For many observers, the situation became another example of how Lazar's life seemed to intersect with government enforcement in ways that felt disproportionate to the underlying facts. Supporters argued that plenty of small scientific suppliers sold similar chemicals at the time, yet few were subjected to multi-year investigations and felony-level scrutiny. They pointed out that the investigation arrived at a moment when Lazar was still a minor public figure in UFO circles, and that the legal pressure mirrored earlier patterns of institutional responses that seemed designed to push him further out of visibility. Skeptics saw the event differently. They argued that the case simply reflected poor business practices, and that Lazar was no different from anyone else who violated federal chemical regulations. They believed the investigation had nothing to do with his past claims and everything to do with regulatory enforcement. For them, the case demonstrated a lack of professionalism rather than a government effort to target him. Lazar himself never framed the case in dramatic terms. In interviews and public comments, he rarely mentioned the legal issues unless asked directly. When he did address it, he typically described it as a technical mistake, one that emerged from the complexity of chemical regulations rather than any malicious intent. He accepted the outcome, paid the fines, and adjusted United Nuclear's operations accordingly. Yet the impact on his life was unmistakable. The case further isolated him from mainstream scientific communities. It reinforced the perception that he was a figure involved in controversial or risky activities. It added a second criminal conviction to his record, which ensured that no future employer, especially any scientific employer, could justify hiring him. And it cemented United Nuclear as not just his primary occupation, but his only remaining path. For someone who once claimed to work on gravity propulsion and extraterrestrial craft, the contrast could not have been sharper. The man who described lifting heavy, curved reactor components with gravity amplifiers was now answering questions from inspectors about potassium perchlorate purity levels and the chemical classification rules for oxidizer shipments. It was a drastic reduction in scale and a reminder of how far Lazar had fallen from the world he once said he knew. Some observers see this period as the moment when Lazar's fate became permanent. Before the 2003-2007 case, there existed a theoretical possibility, however small, that he might re-enter scientific work in a minor capacity. After the case, that possibility disappeared entirely. He became, by necessity, the owner of a small scientific supply business, and nothing more. Whatever future he once imagined for himself in physics or propulsion research would remain sealed behind doors he could never reopen. The 2003-2007 case did not destroy Lazar's life the way the earlier events did, but it solidified the destruction that had already occurred. It transformed a theoretical exclusion into a legal certainty, and it shifted Lazar's identity permanently into the margins, where he would remain for the rest of his life, a man still fascinated by science, but cut off from the institutions capable of advancing it. Chapter 11. The 2016-2017 FBI Raid. What they said versus what Lazar believes. On a cold morning in 2016, Bob Lazar arrived at his business, United Nuclear Scientific, in Langsburg, Michigan. The building sat quietly in a rural industrial area, surrounded by trees and long stretches of country road. It was the kind of place where the loudest sound during work hours was the hum of electrical equipment or the clatter of metal tools in the workshop. But on that morning, nothing about the atmosphere was normal. When Lazar pulled into the lot, he found the building surrounded by vehicles, black SUVs, unmarked trucks, cars with tinted windows, and official-looking vehicles parked at angles that suggested a coordinated operation. Before he could fully process the scene, agents began stepping forward. They came from multiple agencies: the FBI, the Environmental Protection Agency, Michigan State Police, and local sheriff's deputies. The presence of so many organizations was unusual for any inspection, particularly for a business that sold scientific supplies. From the outside, United Nuclear did not look like a facility that could trigger a multi-agency raid. But that morning, it became the center of a federal operation executed with precision. The official explanation for the raid was linked to a homicide. Earlier that year, a woman in Michigan had been poisoned with thallium, a highly toxic, heavy metal once used in rat poison, but banned from consumer sales because of its lethality. Thallium is rarely encountered in modern life. Its presence in a poisoning case immediately triggered a federal investigation. Agents traced possible supply channels throughout the state and discovered that United Nuclear sold thallium compounds in small quantities to customers who demonstrated appropriate need. From the government's perspective, this connection was enough to justify a search. Thallium is tightly regulated, and investigators needed to know whether the substance used in the poisoning could have come from Lazar's business. When asked later about the official reason, both the FBI and the EPA confirmed that the raid existed within the context of a hazardous materials investigation tied to that homicide. No documents suggest they accused Lazar of involvement in the poisoning, nor did they ever allege wrongdoing connected to the crime. But while the official reason was clear on paper, the execution of the raid raised questions almost immediately, particularly for those who witnessed what happened inside the building. Multiple United Nuclear employees were present that day. In interviews given afterward, they described a scene that did not look like a narrow, targeted search for thallium shipment records. They said the agents asked unusual questions, many of which had nothing to do with thallium or hazardous materials. According to several staff members, the agents repeatedly asked about Lazar's background, his alleged time at Los Alamos, his reported work at S4, and whether he had ever stored or retained any special materials from the 1980s. These questions came as a surprise to the employees, who were accustomed to the business being monitored for chemical compliance. But the tone and direction of the FBI's inquiries felt different. Employees later described the agents as being particularly interested in any information about military materials or sensitive metals. Some recalled that the agents asked directly about whether Lazar possessed any sample of the element he had spoken about publicly for decades, element 115, the exotic material he claimed powered the propulsion systems of the S4 craft. The timing made the situation even stranger. The day before the raid, filmmaker Jeremy Corbell had filmed an extended interview with Lazar in which he revisited the details of element 115. Corbell later stated that this conversation was the deepest dive Lazar had taken on 115 in years, and that Lazar had seemed reluctant to speak about the material until that interview. Corbell filmed the discussion as part of his documentary, Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers, which was still in active production at the time. When news of the raid reached Corbell, he immediately felt the timing was too sharp to be a coincidence. He later released a recording of himself walking through United Nuclear hours after the agents left. In the audio, Corbell expresses open frustration. He describes the scene as ridiculous and says the raid happened at the exact moment we talked about 115 yesterday. Come on. He later emphasized in multiple interviews that the FBI questioned employees almost entirely about Lazar, not about thallium shipments. The FBI never confirmed any secondary motive associated with Lazar or his claims. In fact, the agency declined to comment on anything outside the thallium aspect of the investigation. But the statements from employees, combined with the timing relative to the Element 115 interview, turned the event into a source of renewed speculation. Lazar, for his part, spoke about the raid calmly, but with visible irritation. He said the agents spent a long time reviewing computer files, warehouse inventories, and chemical logs. He also said the questions about his past were irrelevant to the supposed purpose of the search, and described the experience as invasive but not confrontational. Lazar made it clear he did not believe the agents were looking for thallium alone. He said they seemed to be searching for anything unusual or exotic, and he insisted that they left disappointed when they found nothing beyond normal scientific supplies. There is another detail that complicates this story. According to Corbell and Lazar, agents from the raid contacted Lazar years earlier. They say certain federal investigators had periodically inquired about materials Lazar might have retained from his time at S4, even though Lazar has always denied possessing anything from the installation. If true, this would suggest a long-standing pattern of interest, not a sudden curiosity triggered by the homicide investigation. Yet no government documents have surfaced to confirm this, and federal agencies rarely comment on investigative history, especially when it crosses into classified or sensitive areas. Whether those earlier inquiries were official, informal, or the result of misunderstandings is impossible to determine from public records alone. The raid lasted hours. By the time agents left, they had taken computers, hard drives, documents, chemical samples, and databases. They left behind a facility in disarray. But despite the scale of the operation, Lazar was never charged with any crime related to the thallium investigation. United Nuclear also continued to operate after the search, albeit with heightened awareness of federal oversight. From a factual standpoint, the raid had two distinct layers. The surface layer was clear and documented. Federal investigators were tracing potential sources of a poison used in a homicide, and United Nuclear, as a supplier of scientific chemicals, was within their investigative scope. But beneath that layer sat an unusual pattern of questioning, one described by multiple witnesses that appeared to reach far beyond thallium and into Lazar's controversial past. The raid's impact on Lazar extended beyond the legal and logistical disruptions. It rekindled the narrative that the government still monitored him decades after he went public. For supporters, it became evidence that Lazar's story had never been dismissed internally, that agencies still tracked his activities and remained alert to the possibility that he had knowledge or material from S4. For skeptics, the situation was simpler. Lazar ran a business selling restricted chemicals, and the raid was a standard enforcement action. But the cultural effect of the raid, its symbolic importance, cannot be ignored. By 2017, Lazar had spent nearly 30 years living outside of institutional science. He avoided UFO circles. He rarely gave interviews. He worked quietly in Michigan and attempted to keep his life small, controlled, and insulated. Yet the raid introduced a moment of renewed exposure, dragging him back into the spotlight and reminding the public that Lazar was not just another business owner. He was, and remains, a figure wrapped in layers of controversy, government interest, and unresolved questions. The raid also strengthened a recurring theme in Lazar's life. Whenever his world intersects with official power, the consequences are disproportionate, intense, and aimed not at his business practices, but at his personal history. No explosive materials were found at United Nuclear, no illegal weapons, no exotic elements. But the scale of the raid and the agents' reported questions created the sense that Lazar's name still carried weight inside certain government systems. Whether that weight comes from truth, myth, institutional memory, or a simple misunderstanding remains unclear. What is clear is that the 2016-2017 raid further solidified Lazar's belief that the government still watches him, and it reinforced the belief among his supporters that, even after all these decades, there are still parts of his story that certain people in power have not forgotten. For Lazar, the raid served as a reminder that he could never fully outrun his past, not as long as his name continued to sit at the intersection of science, secrecy, and suspicion. Even in a quiet town, in a small building filled with beakers and magnets, the legacy of S4 had followed him again. Chapter 12. Permanent Damage. The Life He Lives Now. More than 3 decades have passed since Bob Lazar first stepped into the spotlight and told the world that the United States was studying extraterrestrial craft at a secret installation called S4. When he spoke in 1989, he did so with the conviction that exposing what he saw was worth the risk. But the years that followed would carry consequences so deep and permanent that they reshaped nearly every part of his life. What remains today is a man who lives almost entirely outside the world he once knew. A man defined not by institutions or achievements, but by the aftermath of telling a story no one was supposed to hear. To understand the life Lazar lives now, one must see how every structure that once anchored him, education, employment, clearance, reputation, and personal stability, was gradually stripped away or destroyed. It did not happen all at once. It happened in pieces, each piece compounding the damage of the last, until Lazar was left with a version of his life that barely resembled the one he had before he spoke out. The foundation of the damage begins with his education. Lazar claimed degrees from MIT and Caltech, yet both institutions deny that he ever attended. They cannot produce transcripts, registration logs, or graduation records. The contradiction between his memories and their official statements remains one of the most contentious parts of his story. Independent researchers found people who remembered Lazar at MIT, and George Knapp verified the dorm extension Lazar recalled from memory. But no official record exists today. Whether erased or simply missing, the result is the same. Lazar cannot prove that he ever earned the degrees he says he did. This loss alone was enough to destroy any scientific future he might have had. Without academic credentials, even unclassified laboratory positions became impossible. But the erasure did not stop there. His employment history at Los Alamos, a job documented by phone directories, newspaper profiles, and W-2 tax forms, was also denied by the institution. This meant that Lazar had no way to demonstrate he ever worked inside one of the nation's most important research environments. Even though evidence showed he did, the official line remained firm. He was never there. Then came the erasure of his clearance. Lazar has stated repeatedly that he held a Q-level Department of Energy clearance during his work at Los Alamos and S4. But when reporters and investigators later asked the DOE to confirm it, they said no such record existed. Clearance files, which normally follow a person through their professional life, appeared to have vanished. Without clearance, Lazar was locked out of any classified work forever. Without employment history or academic records, he could not enter the scientific world at all. The 3 pillars that defined his professional identity were gone, leaving him without a past to stand on. As if those losses were not enough, the legal system added another layer of damage. The 1990 Brothel case, which began as a small local charge, was turned into a public scandal. Newspapers published Lazar's name. Television stations framed the story in sensational terms. His cooperation with investigators was buried beneath a headline designed to discredit him. The conviction became a permanent part of his record, one that institutions would later use to reject him, avoid him, or label him as untrustworthy. To many skeptics, the conviction became shorthand for dismissing everything he said about S4. 15 years later, another legal issue arrived. The federal government filed charges against United Nuclear, Lazar's scientific supply company, for shipping restricted chemical oxidizers used in pyrotechnics. Though the case involved regulatory violations, not malicious intent, it still resulted in a guilty plea, fines, and a second criminal record. The conviction solidified the institutional image of Lazar as someone associated with hazardous, controversial, or questionable activities. Even if the violations were minor, the cultural effect was significant. They reinforced the notion that he could not be trusted with sensitive materials or scientific responsibility. The damage did not stop with legal consequences. There were also the investigations. There were the years of quiet surveillance he claimed to experience. There were the interrogations of friends. And then, decades after the original events, the 2016-2017 FBI raid. Agents from multiple agencies swarmed United Nuclear and seized computers, files, and chemical inventories. The official reason was a homicide investigation involving thallium poisoning, a legitimate concern. But employees said the agents asked about something else entirely: Lazar's background, his time at Los Alamos, and even whether he still possessed anything connected to the technology he once described. For Lazar, the message was unmistakable. Even after 30 years, the government's interest had not fully disappeared. Whether the raid was purely procedural or partially motivated by his past, the result was the same: a reminder that his life would never be as private as he hoped. This accumulation of losses left Lazar with no way back into the world he once inhabited. He could not pursue advanced research. He could not work for national laboratories. He could not engage in classified science. The very institutions that should have recorded and preserved his history instead contributed to its disappearance. The message he took from that experience was clear. The life he once lived was permanently closed to him. And so, the man who once spoke about gravity amplifiers, antimatter reactors, and propulsion systems found himself carving out a different kind of existence: smaller, quieter, self-contained. Today, Bob Lazar lives a low-profile life in Michigan. He runs United Nuclear, the same company that began as a sanctuary for his scientific curiosity. The business sells chemicals, rare materials, Geiger counters, radiation samples, magnets, lasers, and other unusual scientific supplies. Lazar spends his days repairing equipment, shipping orders, conducting small experiments, and keeping the business afloat. He does not seek attention. He rarely gives interviews. When he does, his tone is calm, soft-spoken, and often tired. He talks more about science than UFOs. He avoids speculation that goes beyond the facts he claims to have seen firsthand. Visitors describe him as polite, but private. Employees say he prefers working quietly in the back room, surrounded by tools and materials, rather than interacting with customers. He has built a life where scientific work is possible only because he created the environment himself. No university offered him a laboratory. No government facility would grant him access. No corporation would hire him. So he built his own small world, a place where nobody can erase his credentials because they no longer matter. The reputation he carries today is divided, almost evenly, between two extremes. To believers, he is the most important whistleblower in the history of UFO secrecy, a man who risked everything to reveal what he saw, and who suffered consequences consistent with someone telling a deeply protected truth. To skeptics, he is a storyteller whose inconsistencies, erased records, and legal troubles make him an unreliable narrator. Between these extremes lies a smaller group, people who do not claim to know whether Lazar is right or wrong, but who acknowledge that the institutional erasure surrounding him is strange enough to merit scrutiny. Lazar himself does not seem to care about the debate anymore. He rarely tries to defend his name. He does not attempt to repair his credibility. He does not fight critics. If anything, he seems exhausted by the entire topic. In later interviews, he often says he regrets ever speaking publicly. He says the attention brought him nothing but trouble. He says the life he imagined, one filled with scientific progress, academic achievement, and meaningful research, never had a chance to exist after 1989. Instead, the life he lives now is one defined by privacy. He spends his time with his wife, his business, and his experiments. He avoids conferences. He avoids UFO conventions. He avoids publicity of any kind. He has no interest in fame. He has no interest in revisiting his past. He simply lives quietly in the aftermath of decisions and consequences that unfolded over decades. And this is where all the parts of the story meet. Education erased or disputed. Career erased or blocked. Clearance erased or denied. Criminal records used to destroy credibility. Raids and investigations that resurfaced long after the original events. A reputation split between believers and skeptics. And a man who now hides from the spotlight he once stepped into. The destruction was not immediate. It was not theatrical. It was slow, methodical, and total. And today, Lazar's life is the result of that long unraveling. Which raises the final question. The question that hangs over every chapter of his story. The question that has motivated debates for more than 30 years. If none of this were true, why did so many institutions work so hard to tear down one man? Only the audience can answer that.